are going to talk for a few minutes about some similarities and differences between her father's day in the network at CBS, especially when Nixon was president, and today with President Trump. And then Ellen from the library will ask me a few questions, and then audience, you can have at any of us with your own questions. So I know what some of you are thinking, hearing that my show is 30 years old. 30 years, that means 1989. Please take us back to 1989, when things seemed so much more innocent. When we said our Republican president, it referred to George H.W. Bush. When we still had snow in the winter. When the best baseball team in New York was the Mets. By the way, since you laughed at that, I saw a tweet this week that said, if Mike Bloomberg wanted to spend $1 billion on a miserable failure, he could have just bought the Mets. But that's a different speech. Anyway, my program started on September 25th, 1989, with my producer and I sharing a dream that most public radio journalists probably have, to make the world a better place in some way. And within 6 weeks, the Berlin Wall had fallen. And I thought, this is going to be easy. And shortly thereafter, the respected academic Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History, which some of you may remember was the talk of the foreign policy world for a while back then. The end of history theory was that with the fall of communism and the fall of empires and monarchies before that, humanity had reached the end of major struggles over ideology or power. There might be some variations on a theme, but basically the future of pretty much every country would be some form of democratic capitalism or capitalist democracy. And I thought, maybe we're headed for a golden age for humanity, but with no big issues anymore, what will become of my show? Well, less than a year later, August 1990, I took my first summer vacation for my new job, and while I was away, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and President Bush immediately threatened war. History resumed. We've also owned Iraq and its problems ever since, but that's another speech. And by the way, back in 1989, Time magazine ran a cover story about Donald Trump that said, there has been artfully hyped talk about him having political ambitions, worrying about nuclear proliferation, even someday running for president. No matter how far-fetched that may be, the article said, something about his blue-eyed swagger and success has caught the public fancy and made him in many ways a symbol of this acquisitive and mercenary age. Time magazine in 1989. Also that year, his blue-eyed swagger took out newspaper ads calling for the death penalty for the Central Park Five. So history may have ended for the moment in Francis Fukuyama's classroom in 1989, but not for the descendants of 1619, if you know what I mean. We've never had Trump on the show, by the way. I guess we could have sometime as a New York figure in all those years before he started running for president, but the truth was that as a serious-minded, issue-oriented show, it simply never occurred to us. We've had plenty of Republicans, which I guess turned out to be bad judgment since a lot of people in America do take him seriously. But we've had plenty of Republicans and conservatives, of course, Mitch McConnell, Rudy Giuliani, William F. Buckley, Kellyanne Conway, Linda McMahon, to put a Connecticut face on it, even Michael Flynn, and yes, Boris Johnson. But Trump to us was just a real estate developer and colorful character, and we really never had an editorial meeting when we were kicking around guests to discuss any particular issue when the name Donald Trump came up as the most relevant person to try to book, just in case you were wondering. Of course, in the short run, in the early 90s, that first Iraq war looked like a great success. Kuwait was turned back over to its emir, and only 154 Americans got killed in battle. And by 1999, end of the decade, Crime was down, the economy was roaring, the federal government was running annual surpluses, drugs had been invented that meant AIDS no longer had to be a death sentence, and we had the shiny new thing called the internet, where democracy would flourish and people from all kinds of places, Russia, wherever, could connect and all get along. Remember when people thought that? On December 31st, 1999, when the show was 10 years old, we thought the biggest threat to modern life was going to be the Y2K computer bug. But then here came the 21st century. And who thought we'd see the events of September 11th, 2001, or September 15th, 2008, you know what I'm talking about, or Superstorm Sandy in 2012, or Charlottesville, or the Tree of Life Synagogue, and I could go on. During challenging times, my team and I try to help listeners make sense of the senseless and think through the unthinkable and offer a bit of solace, a familiar light in the dark, along with information and debate. And I appreciate that people think I do a good job, but the truth with me, as with most people, is that when you scratch beneath the surface, a lot of what first appears individual is really structural or plain good luck. The reason my show was launched in 1989 was not that I was out there as some kind of star waiting to be discovered. No, it was largely because the federal government had just undone a rule for radio and television stations, nobly called the Fairness Doctrine, which said that multiple diverse points of view must be included when any station, public or commercial, dealt with major controversial issues. And after they killed the Fairness Doctrine, 24/7 opinionated talk mostly replaced traditional public affairs programming on the radio because, frankly, the screamers and haters got more listeners and sold more commercials. So WNYC and some other public radio stations around the country decided that not-for-profit media would take up the mantle. They would carve out the space voluntarily to preserve what was no longer protected as a matter of law, good faith dialogue on issues that matter. And out of that space, a public radio talk show was born. It was born from something structural, from nonprofit media seeing a gap, a public need where government and the market were failing to provide something essential. And I was supremely lucky that they were casting about for a host. At the same time, I was working in commercial radio myself, but already a WNYC member for 6 years at that time, and looking for something better. It's also structural, just to give props to my colleagues, that WNYC has become one of the most important news organizations in any medium for local and investigative reporting. And that certainly wasn't true in 1989 when I started there, when the news department had only 4 very hard-working people, and the big stories were almost always broken by something we used to call newspapers. In those days, I used to think being listener-supported just kept us independent from commercial pressure, kind of an alternative to the mainstream, a super cool alternative maybe, but kind of boutique. But today, as some of you know, the advertising-based business model for for-profit news has been sputtering, especially in certain media. So the old structural reality has actually been stood on its head. Today, being a public radio station that's largely listener-supported and in the nonprofit sector, as a matter of economics, makes us more stable than a lot of commercial media, and therefore central to keeping real journalism viable. No one would have predicted that in 1989. My show, as Shakiba mentioned, won a Peabody Award for what the committee called radio that builds community rather than divides. And we strive to be that in today's polarized world. I guess I'd say if I'm proud of one thing, it's that the community we've been building is broad. So if you've been listening to the show lately, you know that when I've asked for anyone from people who work on Wall Street to people who've had to sleep on the street to call in, they call in. When we invite people, when we invite police officers or anyone who's been arrested and gone to Rikers Island in the city, or people originally from Mexico or Guatemala or Greenland, maybe it'll be the 51st state, they call in. Some of you got that. College professors, domestic workers, truck drivers, Jews, Christians, Muslims, atheists, Trump supporters, AOC supporters, they all call in at the drop of a hat when invited, which also means that they're there to listen to one another. And it's only on public radio, pretty much, these days, that talk show doesn't simply mean talk, it also means listen. I will add, however, that we also run the show on the belief that you don't build community just by welcoming people in. You also get there by stating the truth before your eyes, by calling out lies and corruption and hate when you see them. Because if you can't call out those things, you can't be an honest broker. And the balance has changed, I'm sorry to say, on how much of our time needs to be spent on that. In an era when there's a concerted effort to convince people that truth isn't truth, we've got to state plain facts. But then we try to offer good faith welcome mats to everyone at the same time. Hopefully, the combination rings true. So onward we go after 30 years into an always unpredictable future, apparently with plenty of history to go. Like, how many times have you washed your hands today? Thank you very much. You hear me in the back, okay? No. No. I guess not.
Hello?
Thank you. This is okay? Yes, great. I don't know how much background people have here about this as a Salant lecture. Do you want to give them any basic background about the history of this, or did somebody do that before I came out?
No, I don't think on from the Salant lecture standpoint. There's a room upstairs that is it's a media room that's dedicated to my father, and so that's one way that we've carried forward sort of his legacy. And this Salant lecture series is another way that we've carried his legacy forward. My mother always used to be a big part of the introduction and a part of the library in support of all that. And that has sort of now passed on to me. I always love these lectures because it gives me sort of a touchstone back to what my father what he worked for and what he believed in. And I will just say that he would be rolling in his grave. That's all I can say. We'll talk more about it, but this is just the antithesis of anything he believed in as he ran the news division at CBS. So.
Well, and when Lisa and Chikeba reached out to me and invited me to come here today, I had been aware vaguely of Dick Salant and his reputation. I, probably could have said, if somebody asked me a short answer question, that he had been president of CBS News, and not that much else. So I did pick up a copy of his autobiography and discovered some really interesting parallels with today, that I'm going to ask Sarah to reflect on with me a little bit. So, for example, he recalls Nixon's war on the press. And I wonder if you can just give us any memories of what that was like at that time as you or your father experienced it.
It really had a very big impact in terms of how I saw what was going on in how he worked. He was on, as was Dan Rather, something called the blacklist. Agnew was really the one who sort of, no pun intended, spearheaded that. Um, but Trump calls it the enemy of the people, but it was Nixon's equivalent of the enemy of the people, and he, did what he could. Nixon did what he could to sort of manipulate the press. Now that sounds pretty familiar. My father sort of stood, drew the line in the sand, and he was not going to have any of it. And he was going to stand the ground for what he believed in, which was the press reports the facts. I personally also remember when he was on this blacklist that it impacted us as a family. We had a family vacation planned, and he could not leave New York. So not only did I know about it sort of as a background, but I knew about it, and it affected us personally. Not a bad problem to have, but, still, I was very well aware of what was going on.
Did he, hyperventilate over family dinners, or did he talk about it a lot?
Well, the news was part of our life day in and day out. I mean, he would come home from work. The news would go on. We would talk about the news. He had what we called the three-eyed monster, where in his office in the house, he could watch CBS, NBC, ABC, and see anything that everybody was reporting, whether it was the evening news, whether it was the morning shows, whether it was live coverage. So I don't know if I'd call it venting. It was just living and breathing. And the thing I love now is that we have the same routine in my household. I have 4 boys, and religiously, we sit down and watch the evening news. Generally CBS, unless they're not on for a reason for sports. But, and it's been fascinating to me because all 4 of my boys have become very politically conscious, 2 of them having worked on campaigns already, and it's just nice to see. That is something I think my father would be very proud of, to say these kids are taking it seriously and they're very active.
So I learned some stuff from the book, and one of the passages that was instructive to me, skipping around here around page 72, 73, 74.
Don't have it memorized.
And he wrote, what historically had been occasional presidential spasms of exasperated loss of temper at the press became with Nixon a deliberate, orchestrated White House campaign against it. And he says, Walter Cronkite was right when in a speech on May 17th, 1971, several years before we learned of the transcripts and memoranda that was about the war on the press, Cronkite said, many of us see a clear indication on the part of this administration of a grand conspiracy to destroy the press. And Dick Salant wrote, at the time when I read Cronkite's speech, I thought that he was being a little paranoid. But as usual, Walter proved to be right. The only thing he was wrong about was the qualification that his charges could not be proven, quote, short of documents which probably do not exist. They did turn out to exist, and it turned out that Nixon aide Jeb Magruder had proposed a number of things, including, to quote, and I guess this was in writing in these documents, utilize the antitrust division to investigate various media relating to antitrust violations. Anybody thinking about Amazon right now? Even the threat of antitrust action, I think, would be effective in changing their views, Magruder wrote. Third, Magruder proposed utilizing the Internal Revenue Service as a method to look into various organizations that we are most concerned about. Just a threat of an IRS investigation, just a threat, will probably turn their approach. So it's amazing. I mean, it's just in case we thought that this never happened before.
No, and that's an interesting point, because I think we do all live in sort of existentially and think about, well, it's never been worse than here. And maybe that's true because we're further along in kind of where we are as a country and as a people. But
and one difference might be that those were notes in a document that I don't think they ever actually tried to implement, right?
I don't honestly remember, but clearly there has been historically a place when you've had a president and his people going after the press in ways not dissimilar to what we see today.
Trump just recently, I believe within the last week, filed lawsuits against the New York Times and CNN for over various content. And I will read this also, which will have an eerie echo. I guess this is from something your father delivered in a forum in 1988, looking back on those days, and he wrote, letters by the hundreds came across my desk from people who didn't believe the stories of the fire hoses and the police dogs in Selma, the murder of 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi, the burning of huts at Camden, and the massacre of men, women, and children at My Lai, the break-in at the Watergate, and the subsequent cover-up and lies. We made it all up, insisted the letter writers. We should go back to wherever we came from. So even the go back to wherever we came from,
yeah.
as if, you know, and just the lack of belief in the news being the news. It's and here we are, but I think on a grander scale.
Yeah, and I think that's really sort of a sad commentary, because one of the things that my dad really believed in is the news had to be fact-based. So this whole abolition of the fairness doctrine would have, I mean, he was alive when that happened, but the way it's sort of progressed over time with a lot of bias, you know, really makes it difficult for people to know what is real and what isn't real, because there's so much opinion. And that just, again, he would be rolling in his grave, because it was, the whole point was, the news was about reporting the facts. It was up to the people to decide what it meant to them. It was not up to the anchors or the correspondents. And that no longer exists. I think the broadcast stations and, you know, Channel 13 or NPR do their best to sort of stay that course. But clearly with the cable news entities and whatnot, there's just a lot of noise that I think confuse a lot of people, and it's a very different world in that regard.
Can we make that connection even a little more deeply? Because I told the story of how the creation of my show was born of the abolition of the fairness doctrine. That abolition or the fairness doctrine itself was something your father spoke explicitly about?
It was in the background, because it was not talked about as much as what his point of how he thought it all should be managed. So it was him sticking to his principles of, you know, it must not be, the news must not be manipulated. And I do remember an instance where one of the correspondents sort of manipulated the situation and the scene, and that person no longer was working for CBS anymore. And, you know, it was, he also wrote something called the Book of Standards. And people in the news industry at that point in time, everybody knew about the Book of Standards. And that was, again, a document that laid out the principles of how they should operate as a news entity. And, you know, that was, he lived his belief as opposed to kvetching about everything else.
And I'll make one final connection from then to now, since we're really still dealing with this issue too. Your father was very candid in his book, looking back on the time when there basically were no women on the air in the news division at CBS. He credits somebody named Kay White, who raised his consciousness about a number of things, and writing from the vantage point of the 1970s in this case, he says, it was not so many years before, in the mid-1960s, that I had told a TV guide reporter who was doing a piece on the absence of women reporters in network television news that the reason was that neither men nor women viewers would accept women reporters as authoritative. I was not misquoted. The writer did not take my statement out of context. Heaven forgive me. I said it. I meant what I said, and I said what I meant. It took me a decade to realize how mistaken I was. As my consciousness was raised, so were my shame and determination to reform. Do you remember hearing that at that time?
What I thought, I went back to the book when I knew you and I were going to speak, and what I had to chuckle about in there was also a line saying, I was also highly influenced by my wife and 4 daughters.
And now you have 4 sons.
And now I have 4, yeah, turned out it's fair play, huh? Which I thought was funny, because I don't think I was old enough to have any influence whatsoever, but clearly, my mother in particular was a big force in our house, and I have undoubtedly, she sort of raised his consciousness. The other piece of that, I do remember Kay White, but there was another woman that I remembered by the name of Michelle Clark. And I don't know if anybody in here remembers her, but she was the first African-American woman correspondent. And Dad hired her. And this was, I mean, not only first woman, but first African-American woman. And so he was a real trailblazer. Once he got his conscience on it, when he got that set straight, he really looked forward those, diamonds in a rough. And she was a very big rising star. She unfortunately suffered a very tragic death with an American Airlines crash that happened in, I think it was the 70s at some point. But, that he was really looking to help women break the glass ceiling in that regard. So.
And it's an indication of how slow that process has been industry-wide, that when, Me Too really broke out in 2017, which is 40 plus years later, one of the lessons was not just that there was sexual harassment and sexual assault going on, but that the newsrooms were still not even in terms of gender and gender power. And look what just happened this week. I was thinking when I was rereading that quote the other day about his perception in the 60s, because it wasn't that, as he puts it, it wasn't that he wanted to lock women out. It was that he didn't think that even women viewers would see them as authoritative. And when Elizabeth Warren dropped out of the presidential race, I couldn't help but think that that was because of some of the exact same judgments that people who would have liked to see her be president made, that other people, when she was running against Trump, would not find her authoritative.
Right.
So here we still are to some degree. Well, we're going to go on to the next part of the program. Please thank Sarah Gleason.
Hi, Brian.
Hi, Ellen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ellen Cravato, and my day job is the Director of Development. I've apparently been promoted to Chief Repartee Officer, so please bear with me today. Brian, you may not know, but today is International Women's Day, and you've got 4 women who've just been here chatting and talking with you. We saw the news about Elizabeth Warren. I was wondering if you really wanted to expand on that a little bit today.
Well, I think, what I just said is kind of my most central observation about that. I think that we're all learning through this election year, those of us who are following the polls and the vote counts and everything closely, that there are many different voting demographics in America. And not everybody, thinks the same way, experiences the world the same way, projects on electability the same way. And so, so many people who maybe people in this room know or are, who thought, well, wait, Elizabeth Warren, it was like obvious that she should be one of the finalists. Yeah. She had a core. When you look at the data, her core was well-educated white women. Yeah. And didn't break through for whatever reason, whether media bias helped to set the tone for that not breaking through, or whether people are just different, or to whatever degree, unconscious implicit bias, even among women, still exists toward a woman candidate. I was looking at the data from some of the elections so far. In Nevada, Bernie Sanders got more votes than Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar combined. And 54% of the women, 54% of the voters in that election were women. The 2 women combined got a total of 26% of the women's votes. Yeah. And men got all the others. And it was similar in New Hampshire and Iowa before that, and we saw what happened Super Tuesday when Warren pretty much got wiped out after Klobuchar had dropped out. The Klobuchar voters did not go to Elizabeth Warren. They went to Joe Biden.
Yeah. So one of the things I was looking at when I was looking at the NYC website today was there's a quote there that says, you've got content to satisfy all of our curiosities, whether it's life or art or entertainment or sports or science. And And it occurs to me that WNYC is like a radio broadcast version of libraries. We are in the process in our community of building a new home for our library. We take our ability to bring objective content into the community very, very seriously. I love how you say that you've really got the whole shebang. That might be the new tagline for our capital campaign. And the other thing I think that hasn't been mentioned is when you won the Peabody, the other quote that was given was that you won the award for facilitating reasoned conversation about critical issues and opening it up to everyone within earshot. So I thought you could talk a little bit about how do you cast your net? What does earshot look like today in a splintered world in media?
That's a really good question. Earshot, in the case of our show, built over the years, has involved, any number of things, but one of the things that I've tried to do consciously from the beginning is explicitly invite in different groups of callers.
Right.
So I was going down that list of, types of callers in my remarks, and I guess we learned from experience, my producers and I, early on, that if we just said, okay, here's this issue in the news, what do you think? The same 10 people would call up every single day, every single issue, and think that they had the wisdom, behind their opinions. And it really took asking people explicitly, I should say inviting people explicitly in different groups. And sometimes people make fun of me for this. Sometimes even listeners who wish they were on more make fun of me, for dividing into so many narrow chunks at different times. If we're talking about the elections in Haiti, I'll invite only Haitian Americans to call in for a while. If we're talking about, the Elizabeth Warren issue, I don't think we've done specifically only women in this election cycle, but we've certainly invited different supporters of different candidates to call in and have their own segments. Like, you don't have to compete with the Bernie people or the Biden people or the Warren people in this, but just call in and be who you are. And it brings out different people. We did a national call in on the day of the South Carolina primary, which we knew was going to be determined by African Americans by and large, because about 2/3 or 60%, something like that, of the electorate there in a Democratic primary is African American. So we had a national call in only for black listeners. And they could have been for any candidate. And we had a good, mostly Biden versus Bernie kind of debate break out.
Right.
We've done, one time there was an issue, I'm just trying to think of like the most absurd examples that I could think of, or in the most narrow cast, let's say. There was an issue involving the ports, something about shipping. And we invited stevedores to call in, and they called in. So that, over time, I think to the degree that we've been successful, has built trust on the part of different groups within earshot, because of course in greater New York, so many different kinds of people are within earshot. And yeah, in the fractured media environment, when there are a million things, when we went on the air, we were competing with the other stations on the AM or the FM band, which was a very small set of competitors. Today we're competing with every radio station in the world, because
Sirius
you can stream
XM
it, and the satellite radio, and every podcast in the world. Because another thing, dynamic for us, is live versus on demand, as the expression is, right? Which is clearly what it is. And the station has started to program in that way. We really have basically two big tracks of what we do: the live shows, like mine and others, and the podcasts, which need to be made a little bit differently for listening in the moment, or for listening when you feel like it.
I think there's an audience here for you to expand into from New York, whether it's regular speaking or maybe there's some collaborations with environments like ours. I think that would be exciting for us to look at as a community.
And I want to reinforce what you said about libraries. I've been lucky to have been invited by the Revson Foundation for a few years running to be the presenter of the New York City Branch Library Awards
Wow.
that they give out. And they actually have a competition where users of the library get to nominate and write reasons why their branch library deserves one of the cash awards that they give out. But what winds up happening from our vantage point in the process is we get to articulate on the air the many ways that libraries serve the general public in a year like 2020, which, as I don't have to tell you, is so much more than taking out books. And whether it's helping with internet access for people who don't have it, or whether it's helping fill out the census forms, or whether it's helping with immigration status.
In our case, whether it's hosting a panel of brilliant people on the subject of what is fake news, which we just did a couple of months ago. I think that was very well attended and well regarded.
So you go.
Yeah, we try. So, Brian, you've been at the intersection of politics and entertainment in your incredible career. I would like to know if you have a favorite interviewee.
People always ask me that, and I don't. I duck that question because I don't. It's the callers.
Interesting.
It's the heart of what we do is what we've been talking about a little bit, and who's this next person going to be, and what story are they going to have, and what new information am I going to get, and the rest of the listeners going to get from these people. Again, to use the current Democratic primary season as an example, we did one call-in where we asked people their second choice. And and of course they had to tell us their first choice in order to tell us their second choice. But we kind of blew up the idea of the lanes because there were a lot of Biden people who their second choice was Bernie.
Right.
And you can pick almost any combination for different reasons. What was one we had the other day on one of the national call-ins? I think was what was it? It was he was for Warren, and now that Warren is out, let me get this right. Before Bloomberg dropped out, he was for Warren, and his second choice was Bloomberg. Right, so you can laugh. Progressive lane, anti-billionaire lane, billionaire, moderate lane, what? So this guy said, well, I measure the candidates on the basis of how developed their plans are. And of course, Elizabeth was, I have a plan for that. And then he also saw, and I think he was a New Yorker, and so had judgment from experience that Bloomberg would, even though some would fail, he would come up with very meticulously developed plans.
Yes.
And so there was the people with plans lane, and there are 300 million Americans plus, and everybody's got their own judgment, and we learn that every day.
Well, should we open it up to the audience and get their viewpoints? Yes. Would you like to just stand? Do we have a mic at the front?
How do you want to do it?
There are mics at the front. Or you can shout.
You can,
Shout it out. When you do your interviews, do you ever interview people in person versus on the phone or through other means?
both ways.
And is it a different experience?
It's a great question. Both ways. Certainly people come into our studio, but we've been from day one very aggressive at using the phones and trying to get as good phone quality, obviously, as we can for each telephone guest. But because we are a news-based show and we try to be very on it, so, at least our first segment every day is going to be something that is a lead story of the last 24 hours. So with that kind of booking and that as a priority, we've always used the phones very much to just, that's a luxury of radio as compared to television, that we could do that. And boom, sometimes we book in the middle of the show. Sometimes we're still booking something later in the show if there's breaking news, that's big enough. And it's kind of a different experience to do the two. And sometimes, this is the counterintuitive part, sometimes I even prefer the phone for me as a surrogate for the listeners. You know, the traditional way is, oh, let's get everybody we can to come into the studio because then we're going to have the eye contact, we're going to have the body language, which is true. But there's another way to be a surrogate for the listener, which is they are only having an audio experience. And so if I am only having an audio experience of the guest, it's going to maybe force me in a way that might even be subconscious to probe and bring that person out and react in a way that might more closely replicate what the listener is getting that maybe I would even miss in dribs and drabs here and there if we were in person.
Interesting. Yes, down here.
Does this work? Okay. You've spoken so eloquently about your objective of seeking the facts and the truth. I'm interested in your response when you have someone that you're interviewing who is an out-and-out manipulator of the facts or an out-and-out fabricator, i.e. liar. How do you tend to respond to them when you know exactly that what they're saying has no bearing on reality?
Thank you for that question. And the first thing is to hope that I've prepared well enough that I know the facts that they may be lying about. You don't always know where somebody's going to go. But if you're doing, you know, and if somebody, I mean, we pick and choose our guests for people who are going to have some degree of credibility. Sometimes there are people who are just big enough or influential enough that you're going to invite them on anyway because you need to try to interview this person to try to clarify or fact check in real time or whatever. And then really, hopefully, you know, I will know the right things to say to refute things that are lies or manipulations. And then I try to do it with a tone that is respectful enough that it doesn't devolve. And so that the listeners can actually hear it and people can, and maybe there's a grain of truth in something that the guest is saying, but it's so overinterpreted by them. And if I can acknowledge the grain of truth, maybe we'll have a better conversation. Or if I can not seem like I'm just sneering at them, maybe people who come in agreeing with them because they don't know the actual facts might be a little bit more persuaded toward the facts if we can keep the tone right. So that's a little part of the answer.
I think it's fair to say we can all see your non-sneer just by listening to you, Brian. That's true.
My question relates somewhat to that, and that is, how do you see the nature of our leadership? In other words, if I go back to the Nixon years, the leadership rose up when they heard the tapes. They went to the office and said, "You need to leave. This is wrong," and so on and so forth. Here we have similar things being said, but there is no leadership that confronts and says this is wrong.
I heard
What's happened to the leaderships?
I heard somebody recently say, I wish I could remember who it was, because I think it was a prominent person, and this has got some play, that if Nixon had Fox News, he would have never had to resign. And because people like Dick Salant were in charge kind of the news, the facts ruled the day without things that were fake getting to compete in such a way, but also in a way the other piece of what Sarah and I were talking about, the fairness doctrine, the division of everything toward the opinionated, would, you know, the fact that that's happened now has left people much more suspicious of things that are happening on, quote, the other side. And that's one of the challenges for the press, is if we're reporting facts while trying to be nonpartisan, but then that's portrayed as partisan, then it leaves us in a very tricky situation. I will say about the digital era, that certainly a lot of people, including me, thought when the internet first came in with all the various ways that citizens could post things, that it was going to be the democratization of the press. And is this like the Academy Awards that now?
I was hoping it would be your theme song playing, but
Thank you very much. And, no, I'm kidding. The democracy, because I thought that there was enough criticism of the old mainline networks, no matter how earnest Dick Salant and his compadres were about doing things that were factual and true and balanced. Everybody's got blind spots. So if, that little tiny spot in time that was the three network news era from around the end of World War II until, around the 1990s, that was such an anomaly in American history. What there used to be was a lot of opinionated press. It was mostly in print. But, New York had how many newspapers in 1900? And, people were buying different newspapers based on their politics. And maybe things were getting too homogenized in the sort of liberal elite, if that's the right, or what's the term? The joke that I once heard was, everybody hates the liberal establishment. The Republicans hate it because it's liberal, and Democrats hate it because it's the establishment. And that to some degree applied, with some blind spots probably, to the three network news operations, massive dominance era. And so the hope was, I think, on people both on further to the left and further to the right of what was considered acceptable discourse, that there was going to be more diversity of point of view and citizen reporting and everything. Well, unfortunately, we've seen that while that does exist, and that's to the good, that what has become probably even more dominant is the fact that, lies and misinformation and the polarization that comes with it has dominated. And so to finish the point to your question about leadership, Nixon's fellow Republicans at that time probably didn't have to fear for their constituents' wrath as much as Republicans today do, because the Republican voters really are with Trump. And part of that is because they're getting their own information sources, which may or may not be true. When it comes to things, and again, people can have their opinions, and Trump's policies are fair game for debate on any side, including support, but when it comes to just digging in on either things that aren't factual or facts that people decide don't matter to them, in a funny way, it is democracy, because the populist fervor is more powerful than the leadership of some of the Republican elected officials who might want to lead, but feel like it's just going to happen to them like it happened to Jeff Flake and Bob Corker and a few of the others who didn't even try to run for re-election.
yes, go ahead.
You do something on your show of totally unscientific polling. And I'd argue that most polling is unscientific now, because who would have said Trump was going to win? The problem in polling was people didn't want to say they were going to vote for Trump, and a lot of that polling that went on is what came out of it all. But when you do your unscientific polling, which I find fascinating, do you think it reigns true, a lot of it, though, out of the masses?
Only sometimes. Sometimes we'll get a little indication, and for people who don't know what he's referring to, sometimes I'll do call-ins that I frame, like on election days, on actual election day, I'll do our informal, unofficial, thoroughly unscientific Brian Lehrer Show exit poll. Who did you vote for today, for mayor, for governor, for president? And the point is really just to frame a call-in where people can say what they did and what they think about an election or about an issue. Certainly would do it around issues as well. And generally, I have to, and the listeners have to, approach the results of what happens on our 10 phone lines with a tremendous grain of salt. Because who calls talk shows? It's, generally they say, the scientific surveys say it's well under 10% of the people who listen, probably closer to 1 than to 10. And you have to decide that you want to go through the effort. So it's going to be the people who feel the most strongly about things, who are the most opinionated about things, or who have a vested interest in things. And so it really is unscientific in that respect. So what we're often doing to, peel back the curtain a little bit in those cases are, let's say 8 of the 10 people who get through have the same opinion, but 2 other people don't. We'll make sure to put each of those 2 on the air in the mix with a bunch who are on the majority side, because all we're really trying to do, and I'll usually say this as part of my talk up with the informal unofficial, we're really just trying to create a conversation, and we're trying to get different people in with the different points of view. There have been times where I got indications. One that I remember was on Election Day 1993, when Dinkins, for mayor, was up for re-election, and Giuliani, of course, was his opponent. And we were getting enough calls for Giuliani on the lines that day from people who described themselves as Upper West Side liberals and
They were Ukrainians.
white. Yeah, it was before Rudy was that interested in Ukraine. But no, I'm not saying they were being fake. I'm saying there were white liberals who had voted for Dinkins in '89 who were calling to say that they were voting for Giuliani this time because crime had gotten so bad or for whatever reason. And I thought, that may be an indication of something. And of course, he won that election. We had the opposite the other day when Bloomberg had done so badly in that debate. And I was like, okay, so people, if you were a Bloomberg supporter yesterday, are you still a Bloomberg supporter today? And the phones lit up with people who were calling in to say, yes, the debate doesn't matter. He's still got the best plans, yada, yada. That turned out not to be representative.
Tell us about the screening process. So we call into your show. How many layers do we have to get through before we get on the air?
Well, 1 plus me, kind of. We have 10 lines, like I said. We have a couple of people screening. It's usually a producer and an intern. And for the intern, what an experience. You could only imagine, right? They've come from whatever life they've lived. They're a college student. And maybe the discourse in their classes is very rational and linear. And then they start answering these phone calls from, you're biased against the Bernie supporters, and or whatever it is on any side, or people who are just rambling or whatever. But the first line of defense is usually 1 producer, 1 intern who's screening. They know what my specific question is going to be to try to elicit the most useful thing. One of the other things I like to do on the phones is help us report this story. So it's not just soliciting people's opinions, but it's soliciting people's personal experiences, and that also, relevant experiences to a story. And that'll also bring out callers who don't usually call talk shows. So like when the coronavirus stock market impact had been going for a few days, we did a call in, help us report this story for anybody whose business was being affected. And so we got calls from people in different, different sectors of the economy who had stories to tell, and that helped us report the story. So the screeners are looking for that. And then I am usually making the last call. They'll give me recommendations. They'll put asterisks next to the ones they think are really good, and we'll create the most, either new information or variety of opinion for the listeners, and then I'll pick and choose among those.
So we're all on social media. We're all attached to our phones and Twitter and Facebook. Is there a way for you to draw some of those opinions and people into your show that doesn't require them to be among the 10 or 1%, whichever it is that call in?
And I do watch live during the show our Twitter mentions, right? So anybody who's tweeting with @Brian Lehrer included, and some, I could probably say it on the air more than I say it, that's available. That's another stream of information and questions. Like when we do Ask the Mayor every Friday, then I always promote it. I say, or you can tweet your question, just use the hashtag Ask the Mayor. And, sometimes what's on Twitter, as people have come to associate with Twitter, it's, just snarky bashing of me or a guest or another tweeter who they just read, whatever. But sometimes we get better questions on Twitter than we get on the phone, because it does take a little more effort to write and to condense. You're right. So sometimes we're getting better than people who just want to call up and rant. And also, to your question, sometimes fact-checking of liars is happening in real time with something I don't know, and a tweeter will either, in the spirit of service to me, or you didn't call him on that. Don't you know, you idiot, that the truth is A, not B? But then I'll have it in front of me, and I'll say it, sometimes referring to the tweeter. And so that's another useful stream of fact check.
Like the Cyrano of the internet, or of the, yes.
When I went to journalism school, the most important thing we were told is nobody who reads your stories, or for those of you who are going to be on air, should know anything about what your opinion is. And obviously, I was raised in the Walter Cronkite, Chet Huntley time. What are they being taught in journalism school? Is that still a principle that they're being taught? And is there a chance that we can get civility back in the media, so we can get civility back in our lives? It's hard to have a dinner party nowadays. You got to figure out who you can have in the room and won't scream at each other.
It would be a great question, and I've taught some in the past. I haven't been teaching recently, but it would be a great question for me to ask my interns and young producers how much that's being taught explicitly, that first principle. It is, to some degree, the ethic is changed, and to some degree this applies to me, where rather than just trying to mask your opinion on everything, it may be more honest to say your opinions on some things, but then take a broad, inviting tone, so that, like, sometimes I say the way that my show is different. There was once an article in Time magazine comparing me and Rush Limbaugh. That's not all the article did, but that was, that was a little bit of
first
it.
of all.
And I will never win the presidential medal of freedom just before saying that the CDC is exaggerating the coronavirus to make Trump look bad. But what I've said in response to that is the difference between us is not in our politics. The difference between us that I consider important is that he says, and he says it sometimes as a joke, but it's a half joke, this show isn't about what you think, this show is about what I think. And I will sometimes give my opinion. but in the context of it being about what everybody thinks. And so, you know, I think both the left and the right have moved on a little bit. I wonder, Sarah, what you think of this, if you want to say, or what your father might think of this, that in a lot of, I mean, certainly not on the CBS Evening News, but in some shows like mine that try to be honest forums, you're going to hit your own blind spots if you just try to say, I have no opinions about anything. And you're going to get it from all kinds of groups who are not like you. You're going to get it if your basis sounds liberal. You're going to get it from conservatives. If you're white, you're going to get it from people of color. If you're male, you're going to get it from women. Because the blind spots are real, and sometimes it's just as ethical and in good faith to say something that you think and try to put it in the context of a conversation that is still open to all and where everybody's respected. And as far as civility, that's, you know, unfortunately there, I think it is become civility where opinion is concerned. So the cable news channels are so dominant at this point that it is left to institutions like public radio to try to have a different approach and help to make sure that people are listening to each other as well as talking.
I think Dick Salant was very concerned with the move of news into a field more that looked like entertainment. It's one of the things he spoke about, didn't he, Sarah, at some length in his book. Maybe one or two more questions in the back to the right.
What was the most interesting part of your discussion with Wynton Marsalis?
He was on, the time that he was on, the hook was the anniversary, let me try to get this right, the anniversary of a cemetery in the Bronx where a surprising concentration of jazz greats are buried. And so we were on, or he was pitched to us, I believe, to come on and talk about that. And so it was, you know, without remembering a great detail to make this a great response to your question, I'm also a jazz fan, so it was, you know, one of the times. It's like people ask me, maybe it was the moment that he walked into the room, honestly, because people ask me if I get nervous interviewing all these, you know, big people, and the answer is that I could interview heads of state and secretaries of state and all these power brokers all day, and I'm fine. But when Yogi Berra was on the show, I thought that my legs were going to turn to jelly, and oh my God, I probably came out with more malapropisms than he ever did. And when Wynton Marsalis was on the show, I was like calm on the outside, but it was like the ducks were paddling in my stomach, you know, and I was like, oh God, please don't let me look like an idiot in front of Wynton Marsalis. But we talked about jazz, and you know, I had the excuse of that sort of hook to an issue that made him write for the show that day, to talk about the history of I think it was Woodlawn Cemetery, a part of the Woodlawn Cemetery, and the greats who were buried there, and then some of their legacy.
Last question in the back. Okay, two last questions, two gentlemen in the back.
Within the last few weeks, I saw this debate between he and James Baldwin at Oxford. And I always thought of him as sort of a showman, and he was obviously a creator of modern conservatism. But I was shocked at his strident racism in that summation that he made. And I wonder if when you spoke with him,
Well, it wasn't 1989. It was sometime after that, but yeah.
in any event, what was your, since has been so important in our culture and the evolution of our culture. What was your impression of the
And do you want to ask your question? I'll take the two, and then we'll be done. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. Now that everybody has endorsed Biden, in your mind, who do you think is Warren going to endorse?
Two opposite questions. Let's see you combine those.
I don't think William Buckley would have been for Elizabeth Warren. You know, I think it has become, without remembering exactly what we talked about along these lines, it was a very long time ago, and it was a brief phone interview with Buckley in the context of a book that he had out at that time. I think I did ask him something having to do with race and particular things that he had said. I don't know about that particular encounter. I did see the film of him and who was it, Gore Vidal, where he winds up leveling a anti-gay slur. And it certainly has been discussed about Buckley and discussed on my show about Buckley that there was there seemed to be, I don't want to be the definitive source on this because I'm absolutely not, but that to many people's eyes, there seemed to be some racial animus, even if implicit bias, unintended bias, that colored his conservatism. And, maybe I think I know from seeing the Gore Vidal thing that somebody could get under his skin. And certainly I would imagine somebody like James Baldwin, is that who you said it was? Yes. Would be capable of that. And then Buckley maybe revealed things in that context that you didn't see on Firing Line, which was probably a less diverse setting, for one thing, even if intellectually left and right. And so I think that's all I can really give you on that that's of any use. And I think Elizabeth Warren has a real dilemma because she, by rights, if you follow her, utterances about policy over the many years, she should almost automatically endorse Bernie. And yet she's probably grappling. I mean, a few things could be going on. She could be having the same electability conflictedness in her head and her heart that so many Democrats are having before they vote in the primaries. Like, I really love this one or I really love that one. That's why, so many of the people who've dropped out have dropped out because they had their fans. But people made decisions that other people wouldn't vote the way they voted, or other people wouldn't perceive the way they perceived, and so they gravitated toward, quote, safe choices. And, Elizabeth Warren probably has a version of that going on in her own head, and it must be very, very hard for her because she, she calls herself a capitalist who's trying to fix capitalism, not a democratic socialist, but so many of the policies actually do overlap. And yet, if she really believes that the Congress, the freshman members of Congress who took the House for the Democrats in 2018 are going to get slaughtered with Bernie Sanders at the top of the ticket, and I don't know if that's true, but if she makes that decision, then she's in a very difficult situation. I wonder, I was actually thinking that she might not drop out right away. I think it would have been very interesting a week from tonight when the next debate is, if instead of just the two of them, it was the two of them plus Elizabeth Warren, trying to establish herself even more as the Goldilocks candidate, the one who's not to this and not to this, but just right. And that it might draw a lot of people, even though the delegate lead that the other two have on her was so intense that maybe she thought, or just so large, that maybe she thought, could have thought, that people would ultimately find Biden so unsatisfactory and so much of a risk in his own right for the fall campaign, and Sanders in the ways that people say, that maybe she would wind up with enough delegates that neither of them would get a majority, and that maybe things would, develop toward the convention where she could wind up being a consensus candidate, or even just having that moment before dropping out, maybe next Wednesday after losing again in these next 6 states that are going to vote this week. But after she got up there with just the two of them, I thought maybe that would happen. But, I
Maybe
don't
this
know
week
what
on
she-
your show.
Say it again.
Maybe this week on your show.
Maybe. We will ask, I guess I could end with a plug, right? On Tuesday night, I will be doing another one of those national call-ins in the 7 o'clock hour on that election night. And probably the question that I'm going to pose for people around the country this time is specifically, if you were an Elizabeth Warren supporter, who are you going to vote for now? And I think it'll be very interesting to hear what people say. When I did it for the local show the other day, a lot of callers weren't ready. They needed to go through some stages of grief first. Seriously. And so we'll hear what people from around the country have to say on Tuesday.
Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.